Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's CPI Innovation webinar. NARUC holds these every month on a variety of topics of emerging issues to help support the regulatory community. And my name is Elliot Nethercutt. I'm with NARUC. I work primarily on issues related to the electric system, reliability, resource adequacy, performance-based regulation, and other topics. So naturally, I'm very excited about today's topic, and we have an excellent set of panelists. Before I introduce Commissioner Rendell, our moderator, let me quickly run through NARUC and who we are and what we do. So NARUC was started in 1889. We operate as a nonprofit membership association for state public utility commissions. We work to serve the public interest by improving the quality and effectiveness of public utility regulation. And as for CPI on the next slide, we are grant funded. We work to essentially help share information between states and state commissions and really focus on strategies and lessons learned. There's a ton of resources on our website, and I certainly invite you all to take a look. It's on the slide there at the bottom. And next, we'll go to our moderator. I know we have a lot to cover today. We have, like I said, three great presenters from three different market areas. But now to our moderator, Commissioner Rendell, first appointed to serve as a commissioner of the Washington State Utilities and Transportation Commission by Governor Inslee in December of 2014 for a 6-year term, and has been reappointed and confirmed for a second 6-year term that will end in January of 2027, and is a member of NARUC's Committee on Electricity, Committee on Critical Infrastructure, and prior chair of the Committee on Electricity, and a current member of the Executive Committee. She also serves on the Board of Directors. So Commissioner Rendell, please take it away, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Elliot. I appreciate it, and welcome to all of you today. I'm honored to moderate this panel on recent market design enhancements to address evolving resource adequacy concerns. The panelists today have extensive experience in this area and are going to present details on resource adequacy approaches and changes to those approaches from the Texas ERCOT region, from California, and from New England, also the New England region. So before I introduce the speakers, though, I want to let folks on the webinar know that NARUC is in the process of updating its resource adequacy primer, which was first released in July of 2021. You can currently find it on NARUC's website. Given the pace of change in the resource adequacy space, a team of NARUC staff and state commissioners and staff are working to update the primer with the intent of releasing this new version at NARUC's annual meeting in November, so please stay tuned for that. But first, we're going to hear from Beth Garza, who is a senior fellow with the Energy and Environment Policy team at R Street, and she's going to discuss recent changes in ERCOT, the Electricity Reliability Council of Texas. Prior to joining R Street, Beth served as the deputy director and then the director of ERCOT's Market Monitor starting in 2008. In her 35-year career in the electric utility industry, Beth has served in leadership roles in generation and transmission planning, system operations, and regulatory affairs, as well as market design for both regulated and competitive companies. Next, we'll hear from Anna McKenna, the Vice President of Market Design and Analysis at the California Independent System Operator, or CAISO, who will discuss retail market resource adequacy requirements in CAISO, as well as the RA status across the West. Anna joined the California ISO as Regulatory Assistant General Counsel in 2006, and she's led and advised the ISO through numerous market and infrastructure policy changes, compliance matters, market performance, and monitoring matters. And prior to joining the ISO, Anna was in a private law practice focused on energy market development and transmission congestion management policies. And last but not least, we're going to hear from Stephen Otto, who's a PhD economist with ISO New England. Stephen will discuss the ISO New England's RA approach through a forward capacity market. Stephen joined ISO New England in 2018, and he is currently specializing in capacity accreditation, which he's worked on for the last 2 years. Before his time at the ISO, Stephen received his PhD in applied economics from Cornell University, where he specialized in auction theory and behavioral economics. So as you can see, we have an amazing panel for you this morning, and I'm just going to turn things over now to Beth so she can start her presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne, and welcome. I have very many slides, but I'm going to focus on just a few of them, and really just talking about the actions that we've taken here in Texas that have actually been implemented over the last couple of years. Frankly, all of the excitement is the stuff that hasn't been done yet, so we'll save that for another conversation. But if we'll go to the next slide, please, we'll get going. I'm sure everybody is aware that 2 years ago we suffered a catastrophe here in Texas, and going forward, the variety of market design changes and modifications that have been discussed and implemented really are the result of a couple of things. One is to address some of the failures that led to the catastrophe that was Winter Storm Uri for us here in Texas. The next thing is the broader issue, or the next aspect is the broader issue affecting all of us trying to deal with resource adequacy issues, and that's the changing resource mix. And I describe our resource adequacy challenge as we have an increasingly variable supply mix, trying to serve an increasingly variable and responsive demand. And the goal of resource adequacy is to try to make sure those two moving pieces are connecting or matching up appropriately at appropriate levels. And that, I think, is the challenge that we're all dealing with. And when I say we all, it's not just the U.S., it's a worldwide challenge. And I take some comfort from the fact that nobody's figured out the answer. So it's not that we're all stupid, it's just that it's a really hard problem to deal with. So I'm going to, there's lots of things going on. So if we'll go to the next slide, we'll get started with the, for those that are interested, these are a handful of the key dockets at the Public Utility Commission. Their efforts, sort of I don't want to say the culmination, but a key milestone of the Public Utility Commission's efforts were in December of 2021, so a little over a year ago, where they issued their blueprint for market design. And that blueprint was divided into two pieces. The first piece is what I'm going to talk about today, and those are the phases, or the phase one stuff are things that were kind of in the works or easily implementable, and for the most part have been already accomplished. All of the action and drama is on the phase two stuff, and as I said, we'll save that for a different day. For those that might be interested in, and I'll talk a little bit more about the firm fuel supply, what that is and how that's been implemented. That information is contained in a different docket. And then the phase two evaluation. There were a variety of options that were considered as part of potential phase two market design choice, and the evaluation of that was performed by E3, and their report is available in yet another docket. So if we'll go to the next slide, please. So here's the list of things that have already occurred, and I'll walk through each of these. In ERCOT, we have a operating reserve demand curve, and that implementation here in Texas is different than in most places. Most other markets that co-optimize their ancillary services and with their energy have embedded in that process a demand curve to allow for that co-optimization. We do not. ERCOT does not co-optimize energy and ancillary services in real time. And the operating reserve demand curve is something that's been in place since 2014 initially, and is a specific adder to the real-time clearing price that comes out of SCED. That adder is reflective of the amount of operating reserves available at that time. And so this is a mechanism, as I said, that's existed for several years now. One of the good and bad things about this mechanism is that it is easily accessible in terms of easy to modify. And so it has been modified multiple times in over the last several years. This most recent modification in the aftermath of Winter Storm Uri was to, I'll start with, decrease the offer cap. ERCOT traditionally had a very high offer cap and implied price cap at $9,000 a megawatt hour. That price was reduced to $5,000 a megawatt hour. And in conjunction with that, we increased what's called the minimum contingency level. And that's the level at which, when operating reserves get to that level, that's when the operating reserve demand curve gets to its peak. So we increased the minimum contingency level from 2,000 to 3,000 megawatts at the same time, which would tend to kind of increase the value of the curve. At the same time, we decreased the high value that it rose to. The net effect of both of those has been a much larger contribution from that ORDC adder. And one of the requirements that came with that change was that ERCOT produce a report, and I've provided you a link to that report if you're interested in the details. I also have thoughts about why the value of dropping our system-wide offer cap, that if anybody's interested, I'm happy to respond to that question as well. Next change had to do with our emergency response service. This is primarily a load side program that gets paid a capacity payment. And historically, the goal for that, or the requirement for that, was that, if you were a participant in ERS, you were going to be curtailed in the first stage of a emergency. And now, in practice, most of the participants in ERS got themselves offline before they actually were curtailed, and that creates some issues, or not issues, but there's some concerns that we're paying people to do things that they would have done anyway. I have a more sanguine approach to that. If the goal is to not have the load on, we were historically paying $50 million in aggregate to not have that load on. The mission was accomplished. But in November 21, changes were made to the program that would increase the budget. That is, we'll pay more for the ERS, which presumably leads to more load being part of the program. But that load is now being deployed, or will have to be offline before reaching the declaration of an emergency. So that's a subtle change to the program. I don't know that it's had any kind of detrimental effect to the participation, or I don't think it's had any detrimental effect to the participation in that program. Excuse me, just a moment. As promised, moving on to the firm fuel service. This was a program first implemented last fall for this most recent winter. And basically, the commission identified which units had on-site storage, and we agreed to pay them $53 million for having oil in those tanks. And that service was actually used last December. The mechanics of that program are such that if that stored fuel gets used, during the winter season, ERCOT can decide whether we need to refill or repay those, or as loads, refill those tanks or not. Because we used it so early in the winter season, we did refill those tanks. And again, used it again. It was partially deployed again earlier this winter. This is it's kind of an interesting, for somebody who's been around the industry as long as I have, I certainly remember a time when every natural gas plant in Texas had on-site fuel oil storage. Most of those power plants are no longer with us. Most of those power plants have been retired. The few that remain that have fuel storage are availing themselves of this program. The second round of the program is under discussion right now, and that will likely expand that service to include specific natural gas contracts that allow for firm natural gas, not just supply, but transport. And lots of discussions about what the specifics of that language need to look like, or what qualifies in that. And that is ongoing as we speak. The last couple of things are some changes to our ancillary services that introduce this or expand the capabilities or the inclusion of fast frequency response. This is an opportunity that batteries are very good at providing this service, and expanded their opportunity to provide that. Load participation in non-spin is something that had never really been an issue before, because non-spin had always been kind of a cheap service that gets used frequently, and loads aren't particularly interested in deploying for that. But in the aftermath of the storm, ERCOT is buying lots more non-spin, and the price of that became attractive, and some minor changes were made to allow loads to participate in the provision of that service. For details, non-spin is a 30-minute notice product. So next slide will be my last, which is what are the things we're waiting on? What are things that haven't happened yet? And the one that I really want to point out is this, what I've labeled as customer aggregation. This aggregated DER pilot project has the potential to be a very exciting concept. It's a pilot project in scope to be kinds of tens of megawatts in a variety of service territories, but it's a way for an entity, somebody like Tesla it comes to mind, who sells things to customers, to have the ability for them to aggregate hundreds or thousands of customers to provide the benefit of customer-owned facilities, be those chargers or storage facilities, to contribute and provide ancillary services. Again, this is a pilot project, the scope of which is being firmed up, and the implementation of which will be coming shortly. The new ancillary service products, the roadmap, or the roadmap, PUC's roadmap talked about the voltage support. I don't think that's an issue, and at this point it's only a concept. Nobody's working actively on that. But this new ancillary service, what we're so egocentric here in Texas, we have to include ERCOT in the name of our ancillary service. So ECRS is a 10-minute notice, 2-hour duration product. So this provides for a little longer duration than any of our other ancillary services, and will in some respects complement, and in some respects supplant what some of the capacity that we currently use during our use for our responsive reserve service. Again, that's coming later this summer, and we'll see the effects of that longer duration service. Again, that becomes more important as we have more and more solar, as those in California have seen, more and more solar ramping off at fairly quickly as the sun sets and not, more quickly than the wind is rising. And so we need something for a couple of hours is the idea to ride through that. So with that, I'm going to stop here and look forward to listening to my other panelists on what's going on in other parts of the country.
Thank you so much, Beth. And for those here on the webinar, I think your slides will be available on NERIC's website. And there's some additional slides on what's going on in Texas and some more detail you might be interested in. So thanks so much, Beth. And if you have questions for Beth, if you could please put your questions in the live Q&A, in the Q&A, the Zoom Q&A feature. We're probably not going to have time for live Q&A today, but put those in the Q&A, and if you have questions for Beth, she can respond directly to you then. So now we're going to turn to Anna McKenna from CAISO. So thanks very much, Beth.
Thank you, Commissioner Randall, and hello, everyone. Really happy to be here. I'm honored to be here with this panel and with our moderator, Commissioner Randall. As Beth noted, these are very complicated questions we're all struggling with, so I probably won't provide any enlightening solutions to any of this, but what I'd like to do is give you an overview of the landscape of resource adequacy in California, and it's a little bit of its evolution, and most recently I'll touch on the slice of day approach that is being considered at the California Public Utilities Commission. And then I also would like to touch on the WRAP, the Western Resource Adequacy Program that recently got approved by FERC, and a little comparison between the two. And then finally, I'd like to share with you some insights on how we deal with resource efficiency in the emerging energy markets, both in the Western Energy Imbalance Market, as well as the upcoming extended day ahead market. So next slide, please. So with regards to resource adequacy in California, and in particular, how we, California ISO, are involved in this process, we've been sharing responsibilities with an array of California agencies now since the energy crisis back in 2001, and when the legislature mandated that the California PUC create a resource adequacy program and work in collaboration with the ISO. Since then, it's been a very close relationship between us, and that program has evolved over time. Definitely has gotten more and more intricate, but pretty much the pinnacles of that program have been sort of the mainstay. We operate the balancing authority area, and we cover about 80% of the system in California, as well as a little bit in Nevada. And we also, the PUC is not our only local regulatory authority. We have other local regulatory authorities on our system, which are not under the PUC's jurisdiction. So it does create an opportunity for an array of interdependencies with the local regulatory authorities, as well as the state agencies. The local regulatory authorities in our balancing authority area, they set their own planning reserve margins, and those are individually set by LRA. If they don't set it under our tariff, we administer and we impose a 15% PRM currently. And we also administer the programs that each LRA adopts for their specific jurisdictionals, and we backstop under our tariff to ensure that if these entities have not procured sufficiently to meet their load requirements, we will backstop, as well as some backstop authority, which I'll get into a little bit later, for unforeseeable events. Next slide, please. So there are what I like to refer to as two roads to sufficiency under the PUC program. And a lot of what I talk about for the resource adequacy, although I noted there's multiple LRAs, because the PUC program covers about 80%, 90% of the load in California, it's it's critical that, you know, their program is sort of one of the most sort of pivotal programs in California. So a lot of the stuff that I refer to is sort of based on how they have structured the program. So when you think of sufficiency in California, there are really two roads to sufficiency, as I like to note it. One is the integrated resource planning, and that's a separate program from the annual resource adequacy program that they employ. And the integrated resource planning program is it's a long-term procurement program that ensures procurement over a period of, it's a 10-year look ahead forward process. And it looks at the portfolio of resources that are prescribed by the state's policy goals in meeting the greenhouse gas reduction. And it looks at a 3 to 10 year time horizons for identifying both resource needs as well as procurement requirements. There are some procurement requirements around that. The resource adequacy program, on the other hand, is an annual and monthly process. And it is really more of a bilateral procurement process to ensure that there's enough procurement made on an annual basis to meet the jurisdictional load-serving entities requirements. They work together. They're separate programs, but they're really meant to work together. And it's critical that, and in our mind, and we've been, you know, increasingly advocating that the resource adequacy program be further integrated to ensure that the assumptions made in meeting the load requirements in the IRP are met, if you wish, on an annual basis. So you can assume and, you know, imagine that if the IRP assumes a certain target of existing resources and only then assigns certain amount of capacity needed in future years, you want to make sure that those existing resources are procured for, or assumptions of imports or whatever they may be, that those are actually taken care of. Otherwise, your portfolio that you're looking at in the long-term procurement may not be sustainable. So it's critical that those two programs in our mind are work together. They have been working together, but we are definitely advocating for some additional integration between the two. The load forecasts used in the programs and in the annual process are actually established by the California Energy Commission, so a separate entity that establishes the load that must be met in these programs. And we work very closely with all the agencies around these efforts, including in looking and validating the process of the load forecast setting, we being the ISO. So very integrated landscape, tapestry, if you wish, of meeting resource adequacy requirements. As the balancing authority area, we then integrate all that stuff into the operational time space. We test and validate that the resources that are procured by the local regulatory authorities are sufficient to meet the requirements on the system. And as I'll note later, the couple of ways of doing so. Next slide, please. One of the things that I wanted to touch on as a evolution of the RA program here in California, and it gets a little bit sometimes because it's not out of the IRP, is the tremendous and significant procurement that has been occurring over the past 4 years out of the IRP. This slide shows you about over 18,000 megawatts of new capacity. And that's between 2021 and 2028 expected to be coming on. You can see also that there's been an additional 4 gigawatts of new resources that are expected to be added to that. And that was recently released by the PUC. And in addition, we also, from the latest IRP portfolios that were put out there, they've identified an additional 86 gigawatts. Of course, not all those have been mandated for procurement, but there's a lot of growth and procurement expected and meeting the long-term resource requirements through the IRP. So a lot of capacity coming on. I don't have the storage number on this, but I would note that a lot of this new capacity is storage. Right now we have over 4,500 megawatts of storage on the system. Not all of that came out of the IRP. A lot of that came from prior legislation, but certainly notable presence on our system, largely driven by the greenhouse goals, gas goals, and an effort to ensure a proper mix of resources in our system to be able to deal with the variability. Next slide, please. So I kind of thought I'd share this slide with you all. I'd like to think of it, when you think of RA in the CAISO, we like to think of our 4 pillars of a good RA program. These are nothing new. I'm sure you all, we've seen these elsewhere. And our programs are very much both the PUC programs and the ISO tariff program, which if local regulatory authorities don't have their own individual programs, then we have our program that would apply. So we have requirements setting, much like any RA program, and we also have an annual and seasonal and monthly procurement targets and requirements that are managed both by the LRAs and ourselves. And there are counting rules, and the PUC's counting rules, they qualify the amount of capacity that is, not the amount, the quality of the capacity that's procured to meet those targets. And there's also significant penalties for deficiencies, both that are administered by the PUC, as well as penalties that we administer ourselves through non-availability of resources that are procured through the program. So there's an array of penalties to encourage sufficiency and participation in the ISO market once we get into the operational time space. Some notable changes to the PUC program most recently. The traditional 15% PRM was increased to 16% in 2023. And again, most recently for 2020, sorry, will be increased to 16% for 2023, but and 17% for 2024. Those were based on their annual processes for the resource adequacy program. A lot of discussion now as to what the PRM will look like and be like under Slice-A-Day, which I'll get to in a moment. And as I noted earlier, we've been advocating significantly increasing the harmonization between the IRP and RA, and in part because of the way the targets are set and the studies that are used in the IRP, we feel are quite reliable, 1 in 10 loss of load expectation, and targets that, consistent with other practices across the country that yield a reliable outcome. So that sort of gives you an idea of the kind of programs that are run. Next slide, please. I wanted to get a little bit into what's referred to the slice of day approach at the PUC. A lot of discussion around that over the past year or so. And they are looking to evolve the procurement, how they show, the load serving entities will show and demonstrate that they're meeting their load profiles. And so today, it's a very different approach. It's done a monthly and an annual process. There is an hourly showing requirement. The PUC took a lot of time over the past couple of years to try to address the question of energy actually being available for the capacity that's procured. And they've come up with this slice of day approach, which will require entities to actually demonstrate that they have capacity available in all 24 hours at what they refer to as CAISO's highest load day each month. So the worst day of the month for on the ISO system, entities would have to show that they have the load profile, gross load profile for the resources they procure for those 24 hours. They also, for storage resources, they have to also demonstrate that they meet the storage charging needs, which of course, again, is an additional energy requirement on the system. So they're trying to target that. They'll still have annual and monthly ROE showings, but again, now this time for all 24 hours as opposed to just for the month. LCs, for the gross peak previously. LSC showings will consider also the resource operating capabilities across the day. So if you're not available during the net peak, that makes a difference as to whether or not you could use your solar for that showing at that time. Very critical for their goal of ensuring that there is sufficient energy at the time from the fleet that's procured. As I noted, they'll be assessing to meet the gross load plus the PRM for each hour, no longer just for the gross load for the month. And another notable element coming out of the slice of day is that the counting rules, as we like to refer to them for supply procured, is changing. In particular for solar and wind, there's a lot of movement away from the traditional ELCC approach that has been used in California for some time. And that has been, again, it's an attempt to better quantify actual energy availability during those hours, each hour of the day. Next slide, please. I wanted to touch a little bit on the Western Resource Adequacy Program. This is a program that was developed by the Western Power Pool, and FERC just approved in February. It's one of its kind, first time in the West. Very exciting to have a centralized resource adequacy program. It looks to be, I believe, seeking to go live, if you wish, have its first binding season between 2025 and 28. But as I heard Sarah indicate at a conference recently, 2026 is the desired target goal. So coming very soon. There are two main features of this program, which are similar, I would say, to, as I was describing the California program. You have a forward showing program, which ensures that entities are securing and procuring what they need for an upcoming season. And they also have capacity accreditation rules, just like I described for, in the California program. RAP also has what they refer to as an operational program. And that is, as you get closer to real-time and operational time space, there is an ability for participants who have surplus capacity that was procured to meet the deficit of other participants. And of course, there's bilateral, there's based on compensation and bilateral arrangements are made by the parties. And that allows people in the pool to share based on their ability or not inability to procure it ahead of time. And much like many programs, the regional reliability metric will be also based on a 1 in 10 loss of load expectation metric as well. So that's sort of a high level. The next slide goes into a little bit more detail on the comparison between the slice of day approach and the RAP. I won't go through each comparison, but a couple of things to note. Even though the slice of day changes the way showings are made and procurement is made to target that energy, the underlying opinions of an annual and a monthly showing process is not being transformed at the PUC. So you're still going to have forward procurement by both entities. It's a voluntary program to enter the RAP, but it's mandatory to have the forward showing and also be able to participate in the operational ability to swap capacity if needed. The other thing I wanted to note is that both programs, they both target good counting rules, but they have differences in how they're looking to do so. With the slice of day, the counting rules are moving towards what they refer to as an exceedance methodology, whereas for wind and solar, whereas in the RAP method approach, they're adopting the ELCC approach. We've talked a lot about the differences between the two. We certainly do believe that with the significant presence of variable resources in our system, that it's really critical that you look at the energy side of the capacity that's procured to ensure that you actually have what you need. And net peak, the net peak experience with the solar obviously drives that home. There's a lot of debate between whether ELCC can get you to a reasonable point between or do you need to move to an exceedance methodology? Right now we're watching to see how some of these debates or practice how things work out. And we do think that as RAP evolves and more variable resources are present on the rest of the footprint, there may be adjustments to be made there, but definitely comparable and important to consider. Where do we see ourselves, we the California ISO, in the midst of these emerging and differently emerging programs? It's kind of a interesting place for us to be as we both evolve our markets, but across the West. But I think more importantly, as we coexist with the rest of the West. And as resource adequacy changes across the West, we do believe our role in being able to sort of interoperate between California RA and the rest of the West RA is going to be critical. And we do have ways of providing that kind of interoperability in the real-time space, and also, as we evolve our markets through our resource efficiency evaluation, which I'll get to next. So next slide.
And if you could wrap up quickly, Anna, we need to get on to our next panelist, but thank you.
Okay, sure. So resource efficiency in our markets, it's not an RA program. Just really quickly, we look at this as what we refer to as a universal adapter of whoever comes into our markets with the whatever resource adequacy program is out there. And I'll be happy to answer more questions around this, but I will now pass on the baton to my colleague, and apologies for going over time. Thank you.
No problem. This is all great information. I just wanted to give Stephen enough time. And so now turning to Stephen, and if folks have questions for Anna, if you post them in the Q&A, she can then go in and respond to those. So go ahead, Stephen. Stephen, I'm not sure we can hear you. Can you?
Okay, I'm sorry, I lost audio at the opportune time. I'm glad. Okay, you can hear me now?
Oh, I can hear you now. Go right ahead. Thanks, Stephen.
Perfect. Thank you, Commissioner. My name is Stephen Otto. I'm an economist at CAISO New England, and today I'm just going to briefly talk about an important project that CAISO New England has been engaged in over the last couple of years in the resource adequacy space called the Resource Capacity Accreditation Project. Next slide, please. So just a little bit about us at CAISO New England. We are New England's independent system operator. We plan the transmission system, we administer the region's wholesale electricity markets, and we operate the power system as well. And our vision for the future is to harness the power of competition and of the forthcoming advanced technologies to best reliably plan and operate New England's grid as the region transitions to the clean energy future. Next slide, please. So I think for the presentation today, I'll start with a really high-level overview of resource adequacy as a concept, and specifically in New England, how we tackle resource adequacy through our forward capacity market. And then that naturally leads to a discussion of capacity accreditation, what it is, why it's important in New England, and how we are currently planning to improve our existing accreditation processes to best enable the transition to the clean grid. So next slide, please. So we've heard a lot about resource adequacy already today, but resource adequacy, really defined at a high level, is just the process of ensuring that the system has sufficient capacity to allow us at CAISO New England to balance the system without load shed or rolling blackouts happening more than one day every 10 years in expectation. And thinking really broadly, there are kind of two ways of accomplishing this. One is with an energy-only market like Texas has, where there's really high energy prices when the system is either shedding load or is close to shedding load. And these high prices, help to incent resources to enter the market to ensure that there's enough resources in the system to meet the region's reliability objectives. Alternatively, a region could have a forward capacity market, and that capacity market essentially determines how many resources, how much capacity that system will need to ensure that that 1 day in 10 standard is met. And then the market procures that capacity in a forward auction. And in New England, our forward auction takes place a little bit about 3 years ahead of the period where we actually think we'll need that capacity. Next slide, please. So a little small here, but you can see these are the three different major markets that ISO New England operates. The energy market, our ancillary services market, and the forward capacity market. And it varies a little bit year to year, but each year the capacity market trades a couple to a few $1 billion, worth of capacity. And that's the total quantity of capacity payments that the region is making to resources to make sure that they can be around when the system needs them, when conditions are tight. Next slide, please. So this question here, how do we value the reliability contributions of the different resources that are being procured in the forward capacity market? It's a really central question to the capacity market and really gets at the purpose of why we have capacity accreditation and why it's important. So New England's a little smaller than California or Texas, so we only procure about 31 gigawatts of generating resources, and that's how many were procured in roughly in our most recent capacity auction. But we don't just procure one type of capacity, of course. We have nuclear resources, oil resources, natural gas, wind, solar resources, dual fuel, biomass, any number of different types of resources. And each of these resources produces energy in reserves in a different way, or their kind of profile for how they generate energy is different. And this means that the reliability contributions that they provide to the system are also different. And so, for example, oil and coal resources, well, they can provide energy with enough notice, and assuming that they have their fuel on site, they can provide energy in any hour that we need them to. Gas-only resources can also provide energy in any hour of the day, assuming that, again, we give them enough notice that they need to start up, but also that they're capable of securing natural gas from our pipelines in New England. And this is a big issue in New England right now, because New England is at the very end of the pipelines that bring us natural gas. And so during really cold conditions, when residential customers have first access to natural gas for heating their homes, but also the states that are a little farther upstream the natural gas pipeline, they all will have the ability to access gas before New England does. And this may mean that during the coldest conditions, our power plants may not be able to access fuel when we need them to produce. Now, next, we have intermittent resources like solar and wind, and these resources can only provide energy in the hours where their fuel, the sun and the wind, is available. So solar can't produce energy at nighttime, and wind resources can't produce energy when the wind is not blowing. And lastly, we have storage resources, which they can only provide energy up to how much energy they're capable of storing. So if we have a 2-hour battery, that 2-hour battery can only provide energy for 2 hours. And if we have a load shed event that lasts for 10 hours, then that 2-hour battery may not be providing the same contribution to reliability that, say, an oil or a nuclear resource that can operate for all 10 hours would provide. And so given these differences, 1 megawatt of one resource doesn't necessarily provide the same contribution to resource adequacy as a megawatt of another resource. Next slide, please. And so because the resources don't provide the same contributions to reliability, their payment should also be different. And that's what capacity accreditation as a process attempts to accomplish. And so the ISO procures capacity to meet our reliability requirements through the forward capacity market, but each individual resource has to have a different amount of physical capability to sell us 1 unit of capacity. So, for example, a solar resource, if they want to sell 100 megawatts of capacity in the forward capacity market, they may need to construct enough solar panels to be able to, in concept, produce 500 megawatts of energy, 500 megawatts of nameplate capacity. While a nuclear resource may only need to build 110 megawatts of nameplate capacity, a physical capability, to be able to sell 100 megawatts of capacity in the forward capacity market. And so this determines essentially how much resources get paid. If you provide less to reliability on the margin, then you're going to have to build more megawatts of nameplate capacity to receive the same amount of capacity revenue as a resource that provides more reliability on the margin. Next slide, please. So we have an existing capacity accreditation process that's been around pretty much since the dawn of our capacity market, but we are now updating it. And we're updating it to make several improvements that I'll walk through quickly in a second. But I think first it's important to set the stage for why we're updating it. So next slide, please. So New England's resource mix, and particularly our energy mix, has changed an enormous amount in the last 20 years. So you can see here that in 2020, the system was getting almost 40% of its energy from oil and coal resources. And the biggest change that you can see here is that we've seen a huge decrease in the quantity of energy that's coming from oil and coal resources. And almost all of that, if not even slightly more than that energy, has been replaced by a large uptick in the production from the natural gas fleet. We've also seen some retirements of nuclear plants that have decreased their share of the energy mix a little bit. And also of note, we've seen a 50% increase in the share of the energy mix coming from renewable energy resources. So we've seen a big change already in the past 20 years, but given the very ambitious climate change, clean energy goals of the New England states, we expect a similar change to happen in the next 20 or 30 years as well, where an enormous amount of new clean energy resources are going to enter the mix, and renewable resources will be creating a larger and larger portion of the energy needs for the system throughout the year. Next slide, please. We can see that pretty clearly here, where this is the queue of all of the different resources that could be built. Not all of these resources will be built, but of the resources that will be built in potentially in the next 10 years, we can see that, you know, almost 98% of those resources are either wind, solar, or battery storage. And so the purposes of the Capacity Accreditation Project are to broadly improve our accreditation technique, not just for these resources, but with a specific eye towards making sure that as these resources enter the mix, as they start to constitute an increasingly large share of the resource mix and provide an increasingly large share of the system's energy needs, that our accreditation tools are up to that task. Next slide, please. So the accreditation project is highly complex, but I think we could think of it as providing four major benefits over the current existing rules that I'll just detail now before closing. And those four benefits are that we will, with the RCA reforms, we will better model the correlated performance of intermittent resources, and I'll explain why that's important in a moment. We will model the differences in storage resources' stored energy levels, which is not something that we do today. We will model the gas limitations during the wintertime for gas-only resources, which is also not something we do today. And then we will also model the differences in resources' expected outage rates. So I'll explain why that's important momentarily as well. Next slide, please. So first up, for our intermittent resources, of course, have highly correlated output. So, you know, all of the solar resources might be producing at noon, but we definitely know that all of them are not going to be producing at midnight. And so this is also true for wind resources, where when the wind is strong, all of the wind resources that are generally in that same geographical area will likely have higher output levels. And so if we think about the intermittent resources making a larger and larger share of the resource mix, these highly correlated output profiles for these resources are therefore going to be increasingly correlated with the hours that are important for the purposes of resource adequacy. And so what I mean is, if, you know, half of the system is made up of wind resources, for example, the hours where we're going to be most concerned about being able to make sure that we avoid rolling blackouts are likely going to be the hours where those resources, which make up a majority of the system, are performing most poorly. And so the RCA reforms, the Resource Capacity Accreditation reforms, are going to take into account the fact that as more resources of these type enter the mix, their performance is going to become increasingly correlated with the kind of resource adequacy hours that we're worried about. Next slide, please. So under the current rules that govern the accreditation process for ISO New England's capacity market, we don't account for the different stored energy levels beyond 2 hours. So a 2-hour battery that's 100 megawatts receives the same compensation as an 8-hour battery that's 100 megawatts. Whereas, in fact, we imagine that, you know, an 8-hour battery very well would likely have a higher reliability contribution because they will be able to provide more energy for longer on days when conditions are particularly tight. And that's something that we're going to take into account with the new reforms that we're working on now. Next slide, please. So we also, as I mentioned, our current resource adequacy process does not account for the potential for the pipeline to be constrained during the wintertime. And so a 100 megawatt gas only resource and a 100 megawatt oil resource that has its oil on site, they're currently compensated identically in the forward capacity market. While in fact, we imagine that there are going to be some hours in the wintertime where the system really needs as much capacity as we can get, but only the oil resource can perform because the gas only resource cannot. And so these reforms, these RCA reforms, are going to take into account that difference in the reliability contributions of the gas only resources, so that resources that have firm fuel on site or that have contracts for liquefied natural gas will receive more compensation than those that do not. Next slide, please. So last point here, last improvement is that the differences in the expected outage rates of resources are going to now be incorporated into the accreditation value, and so into the compensation for resources. And so, you know, if we think about, we call it the expected forced outage rate, but a really reliable resource might have an expected forced outage rate of 2% that says, you know, only 2% of the time that the ISO calls on the resource to be around will they go on outage. While maybe a less reliable resource might have an expected forced outage rate of 30%. And under the current rules, 2 resources that are both 100 megawatts but have those different outage rates will be compensated identically. And I think one of the improvements that the RCA reforms are going to make is that it's going to, the accreditation process will now account for the differences in these outage rates, so that resources that are less likely to be on outage during the hours when they would be most useful for maintaining resource adequacy, or for maintaining system reliability, rather, those resources are going to be compensated more than resources that are more likely to be on outage during those hours that we really need them. Next slide, please. So just wrapping up here, last slide. All of these kind of changes that we're making right now, this project that we're trying to push through, this is going to result in an accreditation values that better reflect all of the different reliability contributions of the many disparate resources that make up the resource mix in ISO New England. And by paying each of these resources in a manner that is more commensurate with their modeled contribution to reliability, our capacity market is going to do a better job at cost effectively procuring capacity to meet our region's resource adequacy objectives of ensuring that you know, we limit load shed to 1 day in 10 in expectation. So that's all I have. Thank you all very much. And if anyone has any questions afterwards, please feel free to reach out to me, and I'd be happy to discuss further.
Thank you, Stephen, and appreciate all the panelists being able to make their presentations. We are at time, but I have, if folks can stay on, I have at least one question to start with, and considering that this webinar is being hosted by the NARUC Center for Partnerships and Innovation, and focus, this is a service for state commissions around the country. I'm wondering if you can all provide some example or talk about in your experience whether there are effective approaches that each of the market operators have used to engage with the state commissions on these resource adequacy issues, and maybe provide some examples of how state commissions are engaging with the markets, and ways that you bring in those perspectives. I realize for those single state markets, you have one commission that you're dealing with, but if you have thoughts, that'd be great.
I was I was going to say, I think this question is best answered by Stephen, who's got, he's got multiple states that he has to deal with and figure out a common purpose. I know in Texas there's no gap. There's no gap between the PUC and ERCOT, and I would, California has their own challenges with their multiple agencies, but certainly in Texas, there's no gap.
Yeah, I'm happy to speak to this. So any kind of change in the resource adequacy process in New England or change in the forward capacity market in particular, we have extensive interaction with the stakeholder community. And so in New England, we have the New England Power Pool, NEPOOL, and NEPOOL and the ISO kind of jointly conduct that stakeholder process. And the public utility commissioners, they're not voting members in NEPOOL, but they are involved in the stakeholder process and they have a seat at the table. So they can help shape the proposals that the ISO has that we try to push through the stakeholder process to FERC. And so, for example, in the RCA project, we are, currently conducting stakeholder presentations at our markets committee, and these have the opportunity for a lot of opportunity for stakeholders to have input on these issues, including our regulators. And so that's one way that we interact with the public utility commissioners. We also have interactions through the NECPUC, which is, I believe, the New England, I forget what the C stands for. It's the Committee of Public Utility Commissioners, I think. And so they're actively involved as well in the stakeholder discussions, but we also interact with NESCO, which is the New England States Committee on Electricity, which is our FERC-approved regional state authority, or an organization might be a better way of describing it. They kind of helped to engage and provide some of the perspective that the states have and bring their policy goals and objectives to the stakeholder process. And so, for example, we recently had a future grid reliability study. There was an economic study, and NESCO had a lot of input on that, and we worked closely with NESCO to make sure that we were trying to involve the states as much as possible in the work that we did there. It's the New England Conference of Public Utility Commissioners, by the way, not committee. So apologize for that error. But so yeah, I think that those are the primary avenues through which we work with the public utility commissioners on our projects. Hope that spoke to the question.
Yes, it does. And I think folks are beginning to drop off. You all had excellent presentations identifying some of the really critical issues as the nature of the resource mix changes and how we count capacity, how we consider energy issues, and all the different ways that markets are based. So thank you all for your participation today. I'm going to turn this back over to either Elliot or Jessica to close us out.
Thank you, Commissioner. I think we are all set. Really appreciate you and the panelists today. So with that, we'll go ahead and end the webinar. Thank you again.
Thank you.